Good morning, everybody. My name is Alexandra Cox, and I'm a research scholar at Yale University Law School's Justice Collaboratory, and I'm also a professor at the State University of New York in New Paltz. I'm really pleased to be here this morning to moderate this distinguished panel of guests about the role of practitioners in juvenile justice reform. So what I wanted to do to start is really just to get into the meat of the conversation. We have a group of people here who are incredibly accomplished and really sort of leaders in their field. And I think you'll see in your, I believe you have an app for the conference. You'll get to read their bios fully in the conference app. But what I wanted to do was start the panel out by asking each one of our panelists to briefly, very briefly, describe who they are and what their role is where they work, and then to answer this question: what does it mean to you to raise the age of criminal responsibility?
So my name is Dwayne Betts, and my name is Dwayne Betts, and I work in the New Haven Public Defender's Office. And so for me, what raise the age means is I think specifically like about my clients and what it means in the context of my clients. So I'll give like a two-part answer. The first part is it's just rhetorical, but it's important in its rhetoric. When you had Minister Society, when you had Super Predator, that was also rhetoric. But that was rhetoric that led to a shift in the way that we dealt with young people, in the way that we thought about young people in the criminal justice system. And sadly, when you say young people in the criminal justice system, you are usually talking about young people of color in the criminal justice system. And so when you say super predator, you are distancing them further from the community and arguing that they are a violent presence that needs to be contained and controlled. When you say raise the age, you are arguing, I think, for a rhetoric that suggests, that explains, that demands that we think about all of these young people in the way that we think about our own children. And so for me, raise the age has all of this scientific rationale to it, and I believe in that. It has all of the sort of rationale behind what kind of charges we're talking about, and I believe in that too. But I think the rhetoric is the most important piece, because we really haven't dialed back the threat that that many people have when they think about young black men. And then the other piece, and I'll just say this because I think it's important for me to say, is while I support raise the age, I think that we should think about other mechanisms like the youthful offender laws that give defense attorneys, prosecutors, and judges a more robust set of mechanisms that allow us to say we have this young person who confesses to committing this robbery one, who we know shouldn't be in prison, who we know shouldn't be strapped with a criminal record forever, who we know that carries severe consequences. And so how can we think about the appropriate punishment in that context and think about how we won't have them burdened forever? And I say that from personal experience. I went to Yale Law School, passed the bar, but I also went to prison at 16, spent 8 years in prison, and in 2 or 3 months, the Connecticut bar examiners may very well decide that I'm not fit to practice law. So this is not an academic question for me. This is a real question about what does it mean to cripple a person for the rest of their life with a felony conviction, and what kind of steps can we take to avoid that?
Good morning. My name is Kim Foxx. I am the Cook County State's Attorney. That means I'm the Chief Prosecutor for Cook County, which encompasses the city of Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. So we are the second largest prosecutor's office in the country, behind Los Angeles, and we serve about 5.4 million people in Cook County. When we talk about raise the age, I just assumed office back on December 1st, so I'm slightly 6 months in. I served as a prosecutor for 12 years prior to taking this office, and I also served as chief of staff to our county board president. And 3 years ago, we led an effort, or 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, we led an effort to raise the age for what we have automatic transfers in Cook County. We had raised the age of majority criminal offenses a couple years back up to the age of 18. We did a phase-in from 17-year-olds with misdemeanors, and then we moved it up to 18. But one of the things that we saw, particularly as it related to automatic transfers and as it relates to the work that I do today complements what you just heard. We had a number of 15 years was the cutoff limit for automatic transfers based on certain offenses. At the time, there were 7 different offenses that could have you tried as an adult. The most serious, obviously, being first-degree murder, but the other that we saw more predominantly was armed robbery. And what we saw in the armed robbery cases was that about 48% of the young people were being tried for armed robbery cases as adults. And what ended up, or 48% of the cases that were being tried as adults were armed robbery cases, I apologize. And what we saw overwhelmingly, to the tune of about 92%, those were young black males who were charged with that offense. What we also saw was that the ability to make that charging decision, whether you charged armed robbery or straight robbery, lied solely with the prosecutor. So the determination of whether or not someone would be in juvenile court or adult court for an offense lied solely with how our prosecutors were determining what to charge. So on some offenses, if you could charge someone with armed robbery, they had their hand in their pocket, they motion as though they have a gun in their pocket, we could charge armed robbery with that. Some of our attorneys could say, well, we can't prove that they actually had a gun, I'm not gonna charge robbery, we'll charge straight robbery. And that arbitrary decision-making that was happening in terms of how we were going to affect these young people's lives were held by prosecutors. And it was one of the reasons that I wanted to take on this position, because particularly as it relates to young people, and I served, in the 12 years that I was here previously, I served most of my career in juvenile. What we saw was just that, the handicapping of young people at a very early age and an entanglement in the criminal justice system that started in the schoolhouse with suspensions, that started with fights on the playground, that started with someone having weed in their pocket, and that early entanglement continued on into our adult criminal justice system. So even when we were raising the age, a lot of the damage had already been done when you had a 12 or 13-year-old who's been introduced into the criminal justice system from the schoolhouse. And so the pathway that a lot of these young people were on from that earliest involvement in prosecutions that we were doing, we were filing charges. These things don't happen in a vacuum. It happens with the aid and really the driving of the prosecutor's office. So that's why it's important that we have this conversation, that we have prosecutors at this conversation to talk about, one, the responsibility of the power that we wield in terms of having the discretion to charge and what to charge, and two, looking at the collateral effects of those decisions, not just in the now, when we see a population of young people in our adult criminal justice system that we've touched 5, 6, 7 years ago, to ask ourselves what role have we played to do that, and how do we make our systems better, and how do we learn from our mistakes of the past and implement sound policy that ensures the community is safe and that we're also not damaging a future generation.
Good morning, my name is Steve Tompkins. I am the sheriff in Suffolk County in Massachusetts. I have about 762,000 residents in my county. In my facility, the percentage of African American and Latino males and females is about 65%. And we're talking about in a state where that same demographic is about 17%. It's a big, it makes me wonder how exactly that kind of thing happens. My 18 to 24-year-old cohort is about 20% of my population. And so what I think about often is the fact that we know there's empirical data that speaks to the fact that the human brain takes about 25 or 26 years to fully mature. And so you're going to have individuals that will do something at 16, 17, 18, and although the gravity of their crime is pretty significant, these are still babies, frankly. And to put them in the adult correctional system, I think does serious harm to them. This past weekend, I was asked to speak at Walpole State Prison, and I was part of a restorative justice healing circle. And there were probably about 40 guys in this circle. 3 of those guys were white. The rest were black and Latino. And time after time, they told the story of how they wound up there. And most of them were there for murder charges with a sentence of life and a lot of these crimes were committed when they were teenagers. And one that really struck me was a young man who spoke to the fact that he is now 30. He went into jail when he was 17 with a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And if the average life expectancy of a male or a black male is 72, this guy's got another 42 years that he's looking at behind bars. I say this to say, although the nature of his crime is very serious, at what point do we say enough is enough? Okay, by the time he spent 15, 20 years behind bars and he's matured, he understands the gravity of his crime. If we are a nation of second chances, when do we allow that to really happen? I think it's unjust that we keep people behind bars for their entire lives. I'm also not a fan of the death penalty. So we have to figure out how we make this intersection, how we make these two things work so that society is served properly, but the individuals that have gotten themselves in trouble are also served properly. And I'll close by saying this. One of the things that we're looking at my facility is having a dedicated unit for that 18 to 24-year-old cohort for a couple of reasons. Principally, because of the maturation of their brains, while they're still malleable, we want to put them in an environment where we can work with them before they get themselves in further trouble and recidivate, you see, and have a different kind of curriculum track. That's one point. But the other point, frankly, is that a lot of the older guys, and I'm talking about gentlemen that are 33, 34, 35, say that they don't want to be around the younger guys because they say the younger guys, and the way they say it is, they have no respect for the game. And what they mean by that is, you know, they're saying that younger guys, first and foremost, when you try to educate them and talk to them about why they are in jail and what they need to do to stay out of jail, they're full of steam and bluster, and they don't necessarily want to listen. But then they also go beyond that and say, look, you know, this kind of murder on the street, where you're killing each other in the daytime, where you're shooting at women, where you're shooting at kids, is so far beyond the pale for a lot of these older guys that they find it difficult to educate the younger guys. And so we figure that, you know, we have a shot while they're with us. And I'm a county sheriff, meaning you come to my facility if your sentence is 2.5 years or less. On average, men are with us for 13 months, women are with us for 6 to 9 months. I don't have a heck of a lot of time with them, but the recidivism rate in the Commonwealth is 46%. And so while they are with us, we want to do as much as we can to help them improve their station in life and not recidivate and not come back.
I think this is going to be the easiest. Good morning. I'm Laura Cordes. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. And in our state, that's the coalition of community-based rape crisis centers. And as you can imagine, we serve adolescents, adults, and children, over 6,000 each year. Many victims never disclose, report to the police. So a smaller percentage we're working with through the criminal justice system. Unique to our coalition, and I would say in the anti-sexual violence field, and this has changed quite a bit in the last few years, is that we have for 20 years been engaged with work with offenders. And what that looks like in our state right now is currently really on the adult side, where we have a collaborative model of victim advocates, 12 employed by our organization, who work with specialized sex offender probation and parole units throughout the state. So that involves a collaboration with victim advocates, probation, parole officers, and specialized treatment providers. So that has given us a really, I think, unique look at the needs of victims because we're working with them when someone is coming back out into the community. And so understanding how dissatisfied and how their rights and needs weren't met through the criminal justice process. It's also given us both a skill and thought about how to better reintegrate families and communities and how that works when it's led by victims, because again, most sexual assaults are committed by people that know the victim, and especially that's true among youth under 18. It's also then helped us look at how it is, because we're very focused on prevention, that we can work with people with problem sexual behaviors to help them rebuild their lives and be successful and lower recidivism rates. Coming into the juvenile side is relatively new to victim advocates, and that's true for a couple of reasons, but certainly because those courts, and as they should be, are closed, records sealed, victims still have rights, but it's harder to access. I'm also in a movement that does not believe in putting juveniles on the registry or treating juveniles as adults, and so when I think about raising the age, I think about how proud I am to live in a state where we are looking at this, and we've already done it once, may do it again, and how that's going to save lives, but also how it's going to help build a better system, so we're saving lives of those who have made a mistake, but also the lives of victims who have just really never had the harm that's been inflicted upon them truly recognized by the system, and how their lives have not been rebuilt back in the community, where we kind of do the penalty and then leave everyone. But we know in these particular cases, their families, their friends, their neighbors, and how we have to restore everyone's life.
So, Brent, the question is, if you could briefly introduce yourself and what you do, and then what is your perspective on the issue of raising the age of criminal responsibility based on your experience in the field?
And you mean by going up in age, right?
Going
So
up in
24?
age, yes.
Good morning. My name is Brent Peterkin, and I'm the statewide coordinator for Project Longevity. Project Longevity is a law enforcement and community initiative that's supported by a partnership of multiple law enforcement agencies, essentially, and the Office of the Governor. Our work has many different facets to it. I would say primarily we follow a focused deterrence model of law enforcement, which allows us to communicate directly with street gangs and street groups who drive the majority of the violence in our cities. We operate in Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven. And we focus narrowly on the individuals who have some sort of association, some sort of affiliation with individuals who are driving the violence. And so we find that this population essentially comprises about half to 75% of 1% of a respective city's population, yet they contribute to about typically 70 to 80% of the violence in that city. So like a city like Hartford gets stigmatized as being a violent city, but most of the violence is concentrated in the north end and some parts of the south end. And even within those communities, which are economically depressed and socially marginalized communities that have a stigma of being violent neighborhoods, there's even a smaller number of actors in those communities that are actually driving the violence there as well. And so our work essentially is comprised of a lot of outreach with law enforcement, with social service providers, with civic and community leaders, also with individuals who may have lived the street life but are exemplary of the community's highest values and virtues. And we communicate directly with individuals who are associated with street groups. And the goal is to implore them to desist from violent crime of all nature, but preferably violent crime involving a firearm. But at the core of that communication is a message that we hope counters the street code, really, and that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to actually break up that sense of moral relativism that exists in the streets, right? And so in doing that, we try to promote group accountability, and that's a part of the focused deterrence model. So an individual knows that if there's a homicide committed in the city and it's driven by a street group, then law enforcement is going to focus on the entire street group, not for the homicide, but for whatever it is that they're legally exposed for. So if you're committing any sort of crime, law enforcement is going to focus on you. You're going to get the scrutiny of law enforcement. However, as you've been privy to this articulation of how law enforcement is practicing their strategy, you have an opportunity to make a rational decision, receive whatever supports you need that are customized to your specific needs based upon your specific aspirations. So we won't prescribe to you what you need to do with your life. You tell us what you want to do with your life, and we'll try to accommodate those needs in the best way possible. In all three of our cities, we've had, and some people would say, anecdotally, that there's been an increase in violence that's driven by juveniles. I would agree with that. The data doesn't necessarily reflect that so much. We find that a lot of the people who are involved with shootings, victims and perpetrators, are above the age of 18. They're really within the 18 to 24 age group, and sometimes a little bit older. But we do have a lot of young guys who are both victims and shooters who are under the age of 18. But with the highest concentration being above the age of 18, it makes me think about what it means to raise the age, right? And how do we sort of designate someone as a juvenile? And fortunately, because of Project Longevity, we rest at a point of convergence where law enforcement and a lot of other policy issues kind of meet head on. So on the law enforcement end, what we hear from our law enforcement partners is that raising the age, classifying someone as a juvenile when they're 23, 24 years old, they express a lot of trepidations about that. And one of the reasons why they do that is because they feel like, people who are under the age of 18 have a high degree of impunity because of the way policies are structured towards juveniles in the state of Connecticut. I don't know if I agree with that or disagree with that. I think it's subjective in nature. So what we hear from a lot of our law enforcement partners is that they shouldn't raise the age, right? And they're having a hard time with individuals who are under the age of 18 as it is. However, I grew up, with I knew a lot of people growing up. Some of them were doing absolutely the wrong thing, right? And a lot of them were subject to very punitive laws in New York State, Rockefeller drug laws, things of that nature. And I had a lot of friends who were being incarcerated in the 11th grade, 12th grade, 10th grade, and tried as adults, only for them to come out of prison at 24 years old and have zero options available to them in life. And it was never taken into account whether or not their brain had reached a point of maturation. On the other end, I work with a lot of victims. So I visit young men in the hospital. I visit them after they've been injured from a shooting. I visit their families. I've met guys who've been shot both legs, both femur bones shattered by 45 caliber rounds. And the shooters were 15-year-old kids, right? And so, it's an interesting quagmire. I think for me, sort of my response and the way I interpret the question, at least the intent of the question would be, if you're gonna raise the age, right, and say you're still gonna be designated as a juvenile up to the age of 24, then in my mind, that means that you're going to marshal the necessary supports, right, that would come along with that. Because if most of the young people that I come across under the age of 18, the system has already failed them. So if you don't have the necessary supports in place when I'm 15 years old, what's to lead me to believe that you're gonna have those in place when I'm 23 years old doing the same thing that a 15-year-old is doing? And so I don't necessarily disagree with raising the age, but if it's just to divert people from prison, but to subject them to some of the same fractures that exist now in the juvenile justice system, then to what extent is that going to be beneficial?
Kim, earlier in your remarks, you made a powerful acknowledgement of prosecutorial power. So I'm a young prosecutor, and I'm in your office, and I come to you, and I'm struggling with this new idea about accommodating, thinking about robbery, for example. And how do you, as a person who's kind of leading this initiative in this incredibly large jurisdiction, talk to the people that you work with about trying to think differently about this issue? How do you sort of speak to the people that work with you and who are prosecuting on a daily basis about this issue?
Sure. I mean, I think you start with the acknowledgement of it's not just my prosecutors, but how the country views kind of law and order, what it looks like to hold someone accountable, and what are our mechanisms for accountability, right? Most people who go into prosecution do it because they believe in being champions on behalf of victims and communities, and you have a victim who's been harmed, and your notion of, how do we make a victim whole, or how do we make, society just, has been wholly tied to a system that is based on incarceration. We haven't had, I think, a rich discussion about incarceration and the impacts of it until the last few years, where when we talk about public safety, the question that we have to ask is not just our reaction, but also prevention and intervention. And so, what we try to do, or what I try to do, and it's difficult, right? Because it's not unique to my office. It's not unique to Chicago. This is the system in which, our criminal justice system was built. Accountability equals incarceration, or long incarceration. Long-term suppression will stop you from doing this again, right? There's this notion, the stiffer the penalty, that'll show them. They won't do this again. And what we're doing is we're showing what the data shows, right? When you have a recidivism rate as high as the recidivism rate that we have in Illinois, that's not working. If you talk to victims, and they will tell you, and I know you'll hear some of this from the other panelists, they want the harm to stop. They don't want you to harm someone else. And when you talk to the community recognizes that once these people come back from, whether it's a juvenile institution or an adult institution, they're living among them. So they want them to be productive too, so that the community can thrive. And those aren't conversations that historically prosecutors' offices have held. It is, what is my sentencing range? What is the offer that I can make? And so it's really about slowing that down and saying, and what we've been doing a lot more of, and again, it's only been 6 months, is I'll take a case. We had a really horrible shooting back in April where a 19-year-old is alleged to have shot and killed 4 people outside of a restaurant. And everyone gets horrified, like, oh my gosh, what is this? And the question that I asked, and they said he had a lengthy criminal record. Well, he's 19, so clearly some of that happened as a juvenile. Let's get the file. And when we get the file and we see that the first arrest was at 12, there's never been a question of what's happening in the household. Who's he around? Who's he with? And then the allegation was that the murders that he committed was avenging the death of his father, who was shot the night before, who also had a long record. And the question that we have to continually ask ourselves is, at what point when we touch young people, have we had an intervention that is preventing the future crime, right? That you're accountable and we're deterring you from committing a future crime. It is easy to recommend that someone go to prison for a long time. There's no blowback from that. There's no one's gonna be mad at you other than, the family or the community that's hurt. But from a prosecutorial standpoint, it's easy to just do that. I think it's harder to have the difficult conversations that some of our practices have failed. But I think you have to demonstrate that case, that it's not just Kim Foxx doesn't want you to do this. We are really trying to educate our attorneys across the spectrum, whether it's adolescent brain development, whether it's, the impacts of incarceration on an early age, whether it's around, bond court reform pre-trial, if you're holding people and we know that they end up worse, particularly for low-level offenses. But it's a struggle because it is a cultural, it's American culture, actually. It is not unique to my office. We have become addicted to this notion that the only way that we solve crime is by extraordinarily punitive measures. And as a parent, they say it, he knows better, or how you get them, you whack them on the butt and then they won't do it again. I have 2 children. I am amazed by the things that they continue to do, even when they know better, even though I've punished them. But that's what we know about young people, even from your own experience, you know it. And we have to stop appeasing the appetite of incarceration as solution, because if you look at where we are in Chicago right now, if that was truly the solution, I would not be contending with 764 homicides last year.
Dwayne, you spent a number of years doing juvenile justice policy advocacy work and sort of were immersed in that world, and then you went to law school. And I mean, I think I'm interested to hear as you made the transition to doing criminal defense and representing a mix of young people, young adults, how do you respond to some of Kim's thoughts about doing work in the courts and really sort of trying to advocate for young people in the context of that kind of prosecutorial power, the kind of broader attitudes around mass incarceration?
Yeah, those are actually interesting comments because prosecutors don't talk like that. And I would just like emphasize like the one thing that I thought was really important is usually we talk about violence and we talk about homicides as a way to bring another cudgel into the fight. But what she talked about is you got this 19-year-old kid who allegedly committed this homicide, and then you do a forensic kind of operation to ask what happened in his background, not just for that case, but really to think about the policies that are being instituted today for other cases for kids who are 12, 13, 14, 15. And I think that is like actually really insightful because it sort of maps on to what I find myself doing a lot. I did the advocacy work for a number of years, and it was mostly because like I had been to prison as a juvenile, and so I don't think juveniles should be charged as adults, and I would be on these panels discussing this. And I realized that it wasn't the kind of work that I wanted to do. I wasn't actually keeping anybody out of prison. And so I went to law school. I went to law school because I couldn't get a job, actually. I should just be honest. And I should be honest because part of this conversation really is about what are the ramifications of a criminal conviction. And I had a degree from University of Maryland. I had a MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College, and I published 2 books, and I couldn't get a job. And I lived in Massachusetts. I had a fellowship at Harvard, this fancy fellowship where they gave me a lot of money to write poetry. And even in Boston, I applied for jobs there, and the people would say, well, we got to run a background check. And I would say, I wrote a book. I was in prison. It's in the book. And they would say, yeah, we need to do the background check. And then they would say, well, we can't hire you because you got a criminal record. And there was 2 places in Boston. And so part of my work and part of the reason why I wanted to represent people is recognizing that like sometimes you just have to stop a person from getting a criminal conviction. And the other part of the work is that I really know that when I was 16, I was only looked at my crime. I had a gun, I carjacked somebody. That was the sole basis of the reality that the prosecutor understood. And I knew that I was much more than that. And so when I do the work now, you meet a young person. We had a conversation the other day. My supervisor of attorneys in the audience, I shouldn't probably tell this story. He'll tell me if I'm violating some ethics rule. But we were in a jail cell because they didn't have a holding cell for us to talk to the kid. And we were talking, and then he randomly asked, did you know such and such? And the kid was like, yeah. And the person who we asked if we knew was another kid who got murdered when I was in law school, and he was a client of the public defender's office. Now, what that means, and I read all of this kid's file, right? And I read, and there's a couple clients who are 15, 16, and of course they know this kid because they live in the same community. But what happens is it's only like 1 line in their file. So nobody's asking what has been the impact of that trauma, being exposed to that trauma on their lives. And so I think one of the things that we try to do is when we have these conversations, one with our clients, but also with the judge and the prosecutor, is to raise these questions of trauma on the front end when you are dealing with a crime that doesn't have to end in incarceration. Because let's be clear, even though we talk about the involvement of young people in certain kinds of crimes, we know that there are other mechanisms that every state has to try a kid as an adult. And those mechanisms will exist whether you raise the age from 18 to 700, right? Sure. There will always be a way to send somebody to prison if like the prosecutor says you need to be in prison. And then the defense attorney will fight that. So this conversation about raise the age is really not about those kind of cases. It is about the young men who we represent right now who frankly won't go into prison, right? And it's about how do we talk to the prosecutor, how do we talk to the judge, how do we talk to that child to let them know that, look, we can shift your life around. And this is conceding guilt when sometimes guilt is really at odds, right? But I'm having this conversation as if we're conceding guilt just so that we can have a frank discussion about people who have committed crimes. So anyway, the larger point is that how I do the work is to try to do some of the stuff that Kim suggested and to try to do it with the prosecutor. And sometimes, I think you end up doing it with the family, but the whole idea is to let people know that, like, your life does not, you don't have to let somebody define your life by this moment. And there's a stigma attached to incarceration, but it's also a stigma that's attached to getting arrested. So even if you don't end up in prison, part of the struggle is to help a young person recognize that, like, you don't have to be that thing that we pretend is all you can be based on a criminal conviction, based on an arrest, based on being processed through the system.
I wanted to turn to Laura because I think one of the things that both Kim and Dwayne brought up were the broader collateral consequences of a criminal conviction, and some of the ways that you're beginning to talk to the people that you work with, Kim, about that. And Laura, I mean, you mentioned this briefly, but I'm hoping you can go into a little bit more detail. How is it that your organization came to oppose the registry for young people, for juveniles? And sort of what were some of the conversations that you grappled with as you came to develop that position? And why, I think, did you come to the position with, and in terms of its relationship to public safety and sort of your perception about the system and its effects?
Well, we've never, the federal laws around registry, states can opt in and opt out of. And we've, as far as I've known, never been a state that has done that. So, the nationally, as we've had the conversation about registries in general, I think the public, again, is hanging their hat on that as a tool for public safety. And as if, the treatment and supervision is happening from an online and, online database. And while there are people who utilize it, we know in Connecticut, it really comes from specialized programs and centering some of the victims' needs, the community's needs, and really individualized treatment and programs that look at, as individualized as you can, that look at the risk and protective factors and risk levels for those individuals. So the registry doesn't do any of that. So it certainly wouldn't for juveniles. So if something came up in Connecticut, we would be opposed to doing that. That said, there is, the conversation we're having about, what the system would look like, and to Kim's comment and the discussion we had yesterday about, what no two victims are alike, or their families, and sometimes the victim and a juvenile victim and their parents may disagree about, what they want to see happen. But I think why folks, not only because it's the system that we have, why folks hang on to the penalty and incarceration is a solution, but from having worked with victims, there are certainly some who want that, but I think the system is not set up to where we're acknowledging not just the harm, but really the needs. There's victims' comp, there's services, and that's one thing, to acknowledge the trauma and say, you may need these services and have that, and I'm grateful that we have that in our state. But then there's the real advocacy that says, what would you like to see happen, where somebody can voice, I don't want to see this happening, and what services do we have? And if we're changing the system and don't have those services in place, we're not going to be successful, and that's both for the juvenile involved with sexual problematic behaviors, as well as for the victim. And I mean that not only going into the system, but coming out the other side. So the trauma and the complicated the trust that is broken in a sexual assault from the extended family member, the cousin, the neighbor, her brother's best friend. When people talk about, oh, we're going to ruin his life, and when we have enough media stories where the judges say, well, this young person has, and that's true, but nobody's saying necessarily, and the young person and their family don't hear, what about her life? So there's a lot of minimization that goes on about And people don't see, I had to drop out of school, I had to change my high school, I had to stop going to band practice, all those things that happen in a young person's life after the fact, because the community may, everything that they had for their social supports is impacted as well. And that's where the collaboration on the juvenile side, we want to see more of that. And the way the courts are set up, so if we're extending that, let's reimagine that for victims as well, so we can help everyone in the community heal.
Can I just say, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I mean, and those are absolutely valid. And I think you have to tie that too with, when I look at the girls in my temporary juvenile detention center, 68% of them have a history of having been sexually abused.
Yeah.
So at this moment, they are defendants. At this moment, they are, and I hate to use the word offenders, they're offenders, but they're also victims. And I find when we have conversations about kind of that level of advocacy, that we have to make sure that we're talking about those victims who are currently housed in the offender body, and housed in our defense as defendants. Because you're absolutely right. When you talk about how are they made, whole, what has this done for them, what has the stigma done, both, and I talk about girls because our numbers are readily available and easily to access, but we also have young boys who have been sexually victimized too, who act out in ways. You talk about that one line in a report, oh, they were part of DCFS, our child protection system, for having been sexually assaulted 5 years ago, but we've moved on from that. And when we talk about victims, particularly in the prosecutor space, I'm really trying to get that conversation to be all-inclusive, because the conversations, particularly around that level of advocacy, I would love to see it on both sides, because I think then the solutions, if we would be more sympathetic and empathetic to that defendant who's here on a battery case, who we realize has been dealing with the trauma of her own sexual victimization for years, and this is the extension thereof, then we would work together, even as the new batterer, the person who's been battered, would want the outcomes to be better for her as well. So I didn't mean to jump in, I did, but I just wanted to make sure that we do that.
Valerie Jarrett yesterday talked about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, which I saw a lot of people go, and we see that. And so when we don't acknowledge victims, and there's particular cultural dynamics around sexual assault and victim blaming and minimization, and that keeps people from never disclosing. And we're working with people now who are disclosing because we have the Prison Rape Elimination Act, not always necessarily because of experience of being sexually violated in prison, but because they know there's space for them to disclose and talk about a history of sexual abuse that we're seeing, both incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. But when we don't acknowledge the harm for sexual assault in our society at large, people turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, so drug abuse, sexual abuse, behavioral health problems that may connect them to a crime.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to weigh in, because I know that there's a lot of fluidity in the young people that you work with, and yes.
Yeah, so I think, a couple of things. So we find some of the same correlations where a lot of the guys who are involved with violent crimes have been victims themselves, whether it's firearm-related incidents or otherwise. But I think, so far we've been talking about when people are placed in a position of having to be a defendant and prosecutorial considerations. But I work with a lot of law enforcement. I think that there are things that can be done through law enforcement before they actually get to that point. So, oftentimes that it just becomes what it seems to me is just a part of the job. So someone can be a victim of a violent crime and they're being interrogated at the scene, or they're not treated in such a way that's gonna give law enforcement an opportunity to express some sympathy, maybe even perhaps empathy, just, concern for their circumstances. And, a lot of times it's just the victim is non-compliant. The victim is non-compliant, and they just keep it moving because they didn't get what they wanted out of that engagement. And that's a missed opportunity. So a lot of times we implore our law enforcement partners to be active in community outreach not just through recreation and sports, right? Because if you play basketball,
Right.
all I say when I play ball is pass me the rock. So we try to have organic conversations and try to create an atmosphere where young people will feel comfortable talking to people in law enforcement about their challenges. And oftentimes, many of the officers, seasoned veterans, have arrested their older brother, their uncle, their father, right? Or know the dynamics of the community as far as violence or crime is related, and can speak to these kids' experiences. And that's a missed opportunity, right? Where you can actually develop a relationship, express some concern, and perhaps deepen your engagement, not only with the youth in your community, but with social service providers and other organizations to maybe prevent that kid from having to be a defendant in the first place.
That's great. So, I mean, I think I want to have one more question for Steve, and then we're going to turn to the audience for some questions. Steve, I think one of the challenges of work in prisons and jails is that as an administrator, you're trying to strike that balance between not being too oppressive and not being too relaxed, trying to kind of establish a sense of order in your facility. I'm wondering, I mean, I work in New York, and I worked for many years in criminal defense in New York City, and I always heard the line that the youth facility at Rikers Island was the most violent and dangerous place, right? But I was curious when you spoke about working with young people ages 18 to 24, and I know that there's also an initiative in Connecticut to do the same. How do you think about those questions about striking that balance between being too relaxed and too oppressive with the young people themselves? How do you look at the young people differently?
First and foremost, I want to go back to something that Kim mentioned about prevention and intervention and how we deal with that. Look, I believe, let me backtrack. I grew up in the projects in Harlem in New York City, single-parent household. My mother had a little problem with depression and alcoholism. So there was a certain level of dysfunctionality in my household that I experienced growing up. Juxtapose that to the inmates in my facility now. Unfortunately, a lot of these young men and some of the ladies also have gone through a lot of dysfunctionality, maybe at the home, maybe in school. And so what I look at when you talk about how do we deal with this situation, the first thing that comes to my mind is that the American dream, that ideal of, growing up and having a family and a home and all that sort of stuff, has either been broken for a lot of people or just non-existent for a lot of people. And so that's the point that I start at, knowing that dysfunctionality outside of the facility needs to be addressed as much as what goes on inside the facility. If you look at the urban community that I grew up in, there weren't a lot of resources that are afforded to a lot of the suburban communities. And when you have that absence of care, and I think the hallmark of any vibrant society is that that society wraps its arms around the most compromised individuals in that society. When that is not in evidence, then I think things go off the rails. Let me say this to you. We have had at the same time grandfathers, fathers, and grandsons imprisoned at the same time. We have a lot of gentlemen that actually were born into criminality. This is what they know, unfortunately. And so it's a little hard to break that. And so you have to bring a real level of there but for the grace of God go I, frankly. And you have to understand that these are human beings. And no matter how they arrived at my facility, I have to be conscious of and make sure that my staff, particularly my officers, understand that. When we first got there in 2002, our officers, you could come there, get a job there as an officer at 18 years old. You're talking about kids having jurisdiction over human beings' lives. Now, if I go back to the maturation or lack thereof of the human brain, you're 18, but you can tell, people what to do. Well, oftentimes what they were told to do was so off the rails it was ridiculous. And so we raised that, and we raised our requirements for becoming an officer, and then we had to introduce sensitivity training and a whole bunch of other programs to deal with that, because as much as we want to deal with the inmate population, I found that we have to do equally as much for the labor force. Because if they don't understand what these folks have gone through, no matter what they did to get there, if they don't understand that and have some sensitivity towards that, then it's just going to be Armageddon. It's just going to be ridiculous. So that's how we deal with it, trying to bring understanding on both sides of the equation.
That's great. Well, I want to spend some time hearing from the audience, and just a couple of ground rules. Please say your name and where you work, where you're from. And then also, please limit your comment to a question, not a comment. And then hopefully from our respondents, just sort of a brief response, because it'd be great to hear from as many of you as possible. So do we have any questions to start us out? Okay, got you right here. And please speak up, because we don't actually have microphones. So.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm a grant writer for the Community Renewal Team, which is a community action agency for Harvard. I asked a similar question yesterday to a panel of politicians. I got a lot of answers that didn't answer my questions. So that's typical. But this panel has been wonderfully informative and really productive for me and with my knowledge too. And I am kind of wondering what you all see as the best or one of the best ways to intervene before these kids even get involved with law enforcement, before they get court involved or in any way. You know, how do we as a community build programs or services to really capture these kids' attention and keep them, hopefully, prevent them from getting involved in criminal activity?
I would just start and briefly, you need a lot of community outreach. You need community social organization. That involves breaking down partnership. That involves unselfish leadership. You know, it's competition in the nonprofit sector. Everybody's competing. There's very few paying customers, a lot of people who are providing services. Right? And that's the reality of it, but that needs to stop. You know, there are a lot of points made about broken homes and things of that nature. That's all very true, but I can tell you that street life in and of itself is dysfunctional. So you could have been raised in a household with two parents, great siblings, but when you hit the block, you're on the block. And those are the rules that will dictate the course of your day. And that is devoid of any sense of community. The young men and women that I work with, the word community is not a part of their vernacular. It's the language, it's the jargon that we use. And so you need to inculcate a sense of community in the lives of young people, but that requires us as the adults to get our act together and to form partnerships and to be effective in our outreach and to do that consistently.
I'm gonna say one really quick thing. I went to an event with my son, his class, kindergarten with third graders. They were, at the end of the year, presenting their talents. It was 5, 6 kindergartners playing the piano. It's like, oh, this is kind of impressive. 5, 6 first graders playing the piano, 5, 6 second graders, 5, 6 third graders, 4 kids were playing violin. 2 kids got up and stood and recited poetry. I was invited to the school to teach a poetry workshop. A parent stopped me in the hallway and said, you know, my son has been talking about how amazing Mekhi Miles' dad is because he taught poetry to us, right? And so we talk about partnerships, we talk about organizations, and all of that is legit, right? But of those of us who have means and are raising children, recognize some of the things that our colleagues have done with their children that we wish we would have had access to when we were younger. So I think like one direct thing is some of us just have talents that we don't lend to the school systems. I have never been asked to come to a public school in New Haven. One time I've been asked. I get paid to go to other schools all the time, right? I've called the schools and said, look, you want me to come through? And they say, for what? I'm like, fuck it then, I'm good. You know? So you know, part of the conversation is it's just like basic outreach to the resources in the community and looking at what works and just saying, you know, yeah, if you could play the piano in kindergarten, then you probably won't end up in juvie at 12. If you know what an adjective is at 14, you are likely not to punch somebody in the face. And most of the kids I worked with in juvie who, they don't know what an adjective is. And so we blame them for a lot of their behaviors, but we don't really ask how can we improve the school system in such a way in which they have actually like outlets that provide them for a foundation for their future.
I'll just validate what Dwayne said. That's actually how I met Dwayne. I met him specifically to try to do something in the New Haven public schools, which he was willing to do during a very busy year in law school. But you're right, it wasn't well received.
And you gotta hold, to your point, so all of that, and we have to hold school boards accountable. One of the biggest pipelines to the juvenile justice system in Cook County comes from our school system. School-based arrests where you have I can't tell you how many days I'd go by when I was a supervisor and I'd see, it's like a high school, it's all young people. And then we had school administrators who were sitting there, they're not in classrooms because they're in the courtrooms, on, assault cases. He told me he was gonna beat me up and I felt threatened, and the mechanism by which we were dealing with that was not in the schools but in the courthouses. Or the schools were wanting to expel someone or suspend someone, so they felt the strength in that case, they needed to call the police and start a case. And I don't think that there's been enough scrutiny on looking at that pipeline. We talk about the school to prison pipeline, but usually we talk about it at the prison point and not the school point. And I don't think that there's been enough advocacy around asking, some of these schools, what is your suspension rate? What is your referral rate to the criminal justice system? What do you then need so that you can advocate for whether it's restorative justice programming in the school, whether it's social workers in the school? I mean, the enrichment piece is critical. But I also know that in Chicago and Cook County, there is wide disparities in terms of how we deal with discipline issues in the school. One, which relies heavily on a justice system, and another that relies on enrichment and restorative justice and peer justice. But we don't really, and again, I don't go to all the school board meetings throughout the city. I go to my daughter's school board. And I'm asking questions about, when I hear that there had been a fight in the school, how was that resolved? Because again, I think too much focus comes on what happens once it gets to this system, but the feeders just get off the hook. And the politicians or elected officials, to your point, they're elected to those school boards. And if you listen to some of these folks, and I have, talk about their schools and what they want to do to make their schools safer and how they enact policy, how they enact dress codes. Some of the dress codes, are stunning to me. What you're saying that young people can and cannot wear. And then if you dug deeper, you would see that there's a bit of a stigmatization of communities of color based on some of the things they can and can't wear. And what does that then do to the student who's in that school, who's being told that their style of dress or their hair or whatever? How are we creating systems of alienation in the one place that we're supposed to be enriching and feeding them? So to you, I would say it's not just elected officials at the highest levels. I think we need to go all the way down to those school boards, to library districts. I mean, I live in a town outside of Chicago, is a rather affluent African American. It's racially distinct, but they didn't want 5 people sitting at a library table together. What are you talking about? When you go to the library district meeting, and it was, well, there were these kids being disruptive. That kind of language, those kind of cultures, those kind of norms, you don't have to be on the block to, so that stuff starts early. And I think we spend too much time, up here in electoral politics and not realizing the direct impact that some of these local officials have on creating atmospheres where we see those folks later.
So in Massachusetts, the office of sheriff is an elected position. And so I'll try to speak up for my brothers and sisters there, being an elected official. What I will say is this. In 2013, I was appointed before I had to run for the office. And it was during budget season. And I went up to the State House to talk about our budgets, or lack thereof, because they never fully fund us. They fund us, our fiscal year ends June 30th, but they give us enough money to get into May, and then we have to come and essentially beg to get through the end of the fiscal year. Which is heinous on the face. But the point is this. I'm sitting at a table with a bunch of legislators, a bunch of politicians. And I asked, as they're telling us what we need to do with our dollars, have you ever come to our facility? Do you know what we actually do? Have you talked to either the staff or the inmate population? Do you have an intimate understanding? And I asked them to raise their hand. I said, who's been there? And none of them, not one of them, had ever visited the facility. And so they're working in a vacuum. They don't have the knowledge as to what it really requires. But I'll take it a step further. And picking up, I think, on one of your point there is that we do need to intervene earlier. In our communities, there are not enough social services that really adequately fortify families so that they can be healthy. and thrive. And that goes back again to the politicians. Look, I'm a political nut. I like politics and all that good hoo-ha, right? But I think that, well, first of all, let me say this, and this always gets me in trouble. I believe in term limits, okay? And for any politicians in the room, I'm sorry. But I believe in term limits for this reason. I've found that after a certain number of years, it becomes about protecting your job versus doing your job, you know? And I think that there's something wrong with that. And so what we need to do as citizens of any community is to hold electeds' feet to the fire, to say that we sent you wherever it is that we sent you to do the job on behalf of us, and you need to do it. And if we don't do that, and it can't be done as a flash in the pan, it has to be done with some consistency. I mean, like every week or every day, saying to politicians, you don't have this thing figured out. Look, at the end of the day, we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. So let's comport ourselves as such. Let's act like and work as if we really do give a damn about our communities. And oftentimes, I don't find that. I hear a lot of rhetoric, a lot of conversation, a lot of noise that's not followed up with anything that's, you know, substantive.
Great. Other questions?
How you doing? Shamara Holmes. I am the regional program manager for an organization called Today's Students, Tomorrow's Teachers. And on the side, I am the program manager for Hang Time or Her Time. And we focus on reentry, women who have been incarcerated or women who have been in their lives but incarcerated. My question is, yesterday I was on the juvenile, I attended the juvenile session as well, and politicians were here, and we had a Democratic and Republican, and just the debate between the two. I want to know from your standpoint, what is the conversation when it comes to the age limit? Because are they painting the picture that sometimes our kids are not given the luxury of actually staying kids? They have responsibilities. They're feeding for themselves. Their parents aren't around. They're hungry, so they're sitting in classrooms where they don't even know where their next meal is. So are they painting the picture as the child as a victim from day one? Because in most cases, especially in Bridgeport, we're at, I believe, 32% of the children are under poverty level. Are they understanding that these kids don't have the opportunities always to stay in a child's place? They have to really figure out how they're going to eat, where they're going to buy their uniform, because a lot of the schools in Bridgeport wear uniforms, but that's even an issue. They can't afford it. So our kids, when they're 18, they don't have, they have to grow up fast, but mentally they're not able to stay youthful, you know? So I think that's an issue. Now, how's that conversation as a prosecutor, as, you know, as the law, you know?
So I will say that I was here for that conversation yesterday too.
Right.
I think that was your question that sparked it. Being recorded.
We need her to get elected again.
Look, so there are two competing things that, like, I think bring bipartisanship together, right? You know, you may have one group that has like this moral imperative to see children as children, and then you have another group that has a fiscal kind of, you know, limited dollars, what are we doing? And I think we have in all of our conversations around all of this married the two. How much money are we spending on a failed system? When you talk about the return on investment that we get, you know, if we have a 67% recidivism rate, what business model do you have outside of the prison industry that's okay, that we keep burning money? But I think and so you have to always make that argument. You have to always show kind of what your investment has gotten you. But I listened to that conversation yesterday, and I was literally coming out of my skin. And I think part of it, and I led my remarks yesterday on this panel, having sat through that panel about coming from the projects, about my mother, you know, smoking weed on a daily basis, her battle with depression, my own victimization, all of these things, because people will judge kind of your benefit and your value based on the best of who you appear to be. And I tell that is not like a bootstrap story, but like, if you believe that it's possible for someone like me to be elected the first African American to hold this position, to be elected in that position, the first African American woman to hold it, I'm a girl from the projects. And if every day that we continue to enforce policies that is excluding those particular communities, the most impoverished, because we don't see their potential, we don't use our dollars to invest because we don't believe there's value coming from that. And so the advocacy that we try to do, particularly on this issue, is telling the stories of young folks coming out of the justice system and still having that potential to go to Yale and contribute and be on panels like this, because we have written off so many communities because we don't have proximity to it. And I will say, for anyone who talks about running for office, I mean, if we don't have enough people who have proximity to the issues in the communities and aren't afraid to talk about them in spaces that don't look like them, to talk about that experience without fear of, judgment. I don't care if you judge that my mother smoked weed every day. You know why I tell it? Because it's hard for me as a prosecutor to believe that we should be locking up people who have dual diagnoses of drug addiction and mental health because they're a threat to the community when I was raised by someone to get to this position. And if we don't do that, and we allow people who have no proximity to these issues to dictate policy, and we continue to just respond to them, we get what we get. So I don't know, other than like talking about fiscal, because everybody cares about money, how to change hearts and minds, other than really being hardcore with the facts and the data, and then really pushing the bounds of what people have in terms of expectations for marginalized communities and putting it on them and walking away. That's the only way that I know how to do it.
We have about 5 minutes left, so one more question.
This is for Kim Foxx. I know you just answered, so sorry to the panelists, but I realize you've only been on the job for like 6 months, and I'm wondering if you can speak on like what you've done to change the culture in the office, because your remarks have been really encouraging, but you're not the only prosecutor in the county, and I'm wondering if there's really any pushback to your reform-oriented mindset, and is there anything that you've done that can be replicated in other offices elsewhere, short of like cloning you?
You can clone me at my house so my children can get a good meal. So listen, we've talked about reform from the very beginning. We did a transition report on it just this week. We announced our bail reform policies in our push to around monetary bail and the impact that it has on poor communities. I will tell you that it's a big deal. Cook County Jail, like I said, is the largest single-site jail in the country. 70% of the people in our jail are there for nonviolent offenses, 70%. Most of them are there because they cannot bond out. So that's a big deal that the prosecutor is talking about the impact of pretrial detention and the disparities and how unjust it is to have poor people incarcerated because they can't pay pre-trial. So we've got a lot of pushback, kind of not pushback because philosophically it's like, what are you doing? It's a different way of doing things from the prosecutor's office. Historically, we just stay quiet and let the defense attorney argue mitigation, let the judge make the final determination, so we're not part of it. I don't believe that you can acquiesce to an unjust policy and not be responsible for it. So that means that we've had to go and talk to our assistants and tell them what we're doing. And some of them were really confounded by, why are we doing this? And not because they're bad people and not because they're not good attorneys, but this isn't what we do as prosecutors. This is not the role that we've taken. And I think for me, being able to be bold on these types of issues early, I think allows for other prosecutors' offices to be able to do similar things. And there's kind of this ripple effect, whether it's in Houston or whether it's in Orlando, where people are also speaking up on these issues. And so I think that's very helpful. We hired our first ever chief diversity officer in the state's attorney's office because I have an office that largely brings in communities of color in entry-level positions, but when we looked at our senior leadership team, our senior management team, we had very few people of color in policy-making decisions. So we were very intentional about that. We brought in an ethics officer. The first time we had an ethics officer, because when we look at wrongful convictions, years later, we've had to overturn 7 convictions in the 6 months that I've been here. The question that you have to say is, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? Let's have an ethics officer on the front end to be able to help alleviate some of these issues. And so we've been backing up kind of our theories with actual people and policies and talking. We communicate with our teams, our attorneys, every chance that we get on what we're trying to do. But I will tell you, with an office of 1,200 people, things will happen that you'll read about in the paper and be like, who did that? And so it's hard. And culture change and shift takes time, but I think you can't be wedded to needing to be a people pleaser. You have to be committed to the longer term reform. And one last thing I will say, I met with the Democratic nominee for Pennsylvania, or for Philadelphia last week, Larry Krasner, and I was joking when I was running on a reform campaign talking about incarceration and all of these things, it was a risk. And he was like, yeah, thanks for taking that risk. We stole everything from you. And that made me feel good. I mean, I think you don't have to clone me. When people see some measure of success by you doing these reform things, it opens the door for other people to do it too. And I'm fairly encouraged that that's what's happening right now.
Well, I wanted to thank all the panelists so much. It was incredibly informative and interesting to hear your thoughts on this issue, and thank you too to our great audience. So thanks.